The moment German fighter pilots realized the war was truly lost didn't come during some massive battle or dramatic defeat. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March 1944, when Hauptmann Klaus Weber looked out his cockpit window at 25,000 feet above Germany and saw something that made his blood run cold. American P-51 Mustangs, flying escort formation with B-17 bombers, were approaching Berlin itself. Not just approaching, they were flying deep into the heart of the Reich, with enough fuel to fight their way in, loiter over the target, and fight their way back out again. For German pilots who had grown accustomed to Allied bombers running out of fighter protection halfway across Europe, this sight represented a technological and strategic nightmare that would change everything about the air war over Germany. Weber had been flying combat missions for 3 years, and he thought he understood the rhythm of Allied bombing raids. Heavy bombers would lumber across Europe protected by short-range fighters that would eventually have to turn back due to fuel limitations, leaving the bombers vulnerable to German interceptors for the final approach to their targets. This predictable pattern had allowed German fighter squadrons to inflict devastating losses on unescorted bomber formations, making daylight precision bombing campaigns prohibitively expensive for the Allies. But now, staring at those distinctive, long-nosed Mustangs still flying protective formation over bombers approaching the German capital, Weber realized that everything had changed in ways that German intelligence had failed to anticipate or prepare for. The P-51 Mustang represented a perfect storm of American industrial capability, British aerodynamic innovation, and strategic necessity that German engineers had thought impossible to achieve. When North American aviation was asked to build fighters for Britain in 1940, they created an airframe that was aerodynamically superior to anything flying, then paired it with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to create a fighter that could outperform German aircraft while carrying enough fuel to escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside enemy territory. What the Germans hadn't realized was that American factories were not only producing these aircraft in staggering numbers but had solved the logistical challenges of getting them across the Atlantic and into combat formations fast enough to change the strategic balance of the air war. Major Hans Hartmann, one of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots with over 200 combat missions, later described his first encounter with long-range Mustang escorts in his post-war memoir. "We intercepted a formation of B-24 Liberators over Brunswick, expecting the usual pattern, a few minutes of escort fighter opposition followed by clear runs at the bombers once their protection turned back toward England. Instead, those cursed Mustangs stayed with the bombers throughout the entire attack, fighting us over the target, then escorting the bombers all the way back to the Channel. We lost 6 aircraft that day, and for the first time in my career, I began to understand that we were facing an enemy with resources and capabilities we had grossly underestimated." The psychological impact on German pilots was immediate and devastating. Obergefreiter Friedrich Müller, a young pilot flying his first mission against American bombers, wrote in his diary about the shock of encountering Mustangs over targets that should have been beyond Allied fighter range. "The intelligence briefings told us the American fighters could only escort bombers to the German border before turning back. Today I watched P-51s fighting over Hamburg, then following the bombers back toward England. If American fighters can reach Hamburg, they can reach Berlin. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere in Germany. The war has changed, and we are no longer fighting on terms we can win." What German pilots were witnessing was the culmination of a massive American industrial and technological effort that had been building momentum since 1942. North American Aviation's factory in Inglewood, California, was producing P-51s at a rate of over 400 aircraft per month by 1944, while Packard Motors in Detroit was manufacturing Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license to power these fighters. The combination of American mass production techniques with British engine technology had created a fighter that was not only superior to German aircraft in performance but was being produced in numbers that overwhelmed German manufacturing capacity. For every Mustang the Germans shot down, 3 more were rolling off American assembly lines. The tactical implications of long-range escort capability became clear during the devastating raids of early 1944, when Mustang-escorted bombers began systematically targeting German aircraft factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks deep inside the Reich. Captain Wolfgang Spath, commanding a squadron of Messerschmitt Bf 109s, found himself in impossible tactical situations as American fighters could now maintain air superiority over German airspace for extended periods. Previously, we could choose when and where to engage Allied formations, waiting until their escorts departed before attacking the bombers. Now the escorts never leave, and we must fight on their terms rather than our own. The Americans have seized the initiative in our own skies, and we are reduced to desperate defensive measures that cannot succeed against their numerical and technological advantages. The fuel capacity that allowed Mustangs to escort bombers to Berlin also gave them extended combat capability that German fighters operating near their bases could not match. Lieutenant Ernst Wagner, flying a Focke-Wulf 190, described the frustration of engaging American fighters who seemed to have unlimited endurance compared to German aircraft operating at the edge of their range. The Mustangs would engage us, break off when we gained advantage, then return to attack again and again. They had fuel to fight for hours while we were always calculating our remaining time before having to return to base. In aerial combat, the side that can choose when to engage and when to disengage holds an overwhelming advantage, and the Americans now possessed that advantage deep inside German territory. German industrial capacity, already strained by 4 years of total war, could not respond adequately to this new threat. While American factories were producing over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs during the war, German aircraft production was hampered by bombing raids, material shortages, and the dispersal of manufacturing facilities to avoid Allied attacks. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories were producing excellent fighters in the Bf 109 and FW 190, but in numbers insufficient to counter the flood of Allied aircraft appearing over German skies. Major Hermann Graf, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, noted bitterly in his combat reports that German pilots were often outnumbered 5-1 by Allied fighters, with replacement aircraft arriving too slowly to maintain squadron strength. The training crisis facing the Luftwaffe became critical, as experienced pilots were shot down faster than replacement pilots could be trained. While American pilots arrived in Europe with over 200 hours of flight training and advanced tactical instruction, German pilot training had been reduced to barely 100 hours due to fuel shortages and the need to get pilots into combat quickly. Oberst Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most famous fighter commanders, later wrote that German pilots were being sent into combat against experienced Allied pilots flying superior aircraft with insufficient training and inadequate aircraft numbers. We were asking our young men to perform miracles against impossible odds, and watching them die in numbers that made continuation of effective fighter operations increasingly difficult. The strategic bombing campaign that long-range P-51 escorts made possible devastated German war production in ways that affected every aspect of the country's ability to continue fighting. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, and transportation networks were systematically destroyed by bomber formations that could now operate with impunity deep inside German territory. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, commanding a fighter wing tasked with defending German industrial targets, described the hopelessness of attempting to stop heavily escorted bomber formations with insufficient numbers of German fighters. We would scramble everything we could get airborne, perhaps 30 aircraft, to intercept formations of 500 bombers escorted by 200 fighters. The mathematics of aerial warfare had become impossible for us to overcome through skill or courage alone. The psychological pressure on German civilian populations intensified as Mustang escorted bombers began appearing over previously safe German cities. Hamburg, Dresden, Munich, and eventually Berlin itself came under regular attack by bomber formations that could no longer be stopped by German defenses. Mothers who had felt secure in cities far from the front lines now listened for air raid sirens with the knowledge that American fighters could escort bombers anywhere in Germany. The sight of P-51 Mustangs flying over German cities became a symbol of American technological and industrial supremacy that undermined civilian morale as effectively as the bombs themselves. The impact on German military morale extended beyond the pilot corps to affect ground crews, aircraft mechanics, and support personnel who could see that their efforts were insufficient to maintain air parity with Allied forces. Technical Sergeant Hans Kruger, responsible for maintaining Bf 109 fighters at a base near Stuttgart, wrote in his diary about the frustration of watching superior American aircraft operate with apparent impunity over German airspace. "We work 18 hours a day keeping our fighters operational, only to watch them destroyed faster than we can repair them by Americans flying aircraft we cannot match. The P-51s appear over our base almost daily, shooting up our aircraft on the ground and demonstrating their superiority in ways that make our continued efforts seem futile." German attempts to counter the Mustang threat led to desperate technological gambles that consumed resources without producing effective solutions. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter represented an advanced technological leap that might have restored German air superiority if it had been developed and produced earlier in the war. However, by the time Me-262s began appearing in combat in late 1944, Allied air superiority was so complete that jet fighters could not operate effectively from bases under constant attack. Major Walter Nowotny, commanding the 1st Operational Me-262 unit, found that his revolutionary fighters spent more time avoiding Allied attacks on their airfields than engaging enemy aircraft in combat. The economic impact of long-range escort fighters extended beyond direct combat losses to affect German strategic planning and resource allocation. Fuel shortages, caused partially by bombing raids on oil facilities that P-51 escorts had made possible, forced German pilots to reduce training hours and operational flights to conserve aviation gasoline. This created a vicious cycle where reduced flying time meant less experienced pilots, who were then more vulnerable to experienced Allied pilots flying superior aircraft with unlimited fuel supplies. General of Fighters Adolf Galland estimated that fuel shortages were reducing German fighter effectiveness by 40% even before considering the impact of aircraft and pilot losses. The final German offensive attempts of 1944-1945, including the Battle of the Bulge and Operation Bodenplatte, were hampered by the inability of the Luftwaffe to provide adequate air support due to losses inflicted by long-range Allied fighters. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last major offensive effort on New Year's Day 1945, saw German fighters attempting to destroy Allied aircraft on forward airfields, but resulted in catastrophic losses of experienced German pilots who could not be replaced. Major Heinz Baer, one of the few surviving German aces, described the operation as sending our last experienced pilots on a suicide mission against an enemy with unlimited reserves of aircraft and pilots. The intelligence failure that led German commanders to underestimate American long-range fighter capability reflected broader problems. With Nazi Germany's understanding of Allied industrial and technological capabilities, German intelligence services had focused on tactical information about individual aircraft performance, while failing to grasp the strategic implications of American mass production and technological innovation. The P-51 Mustang represented not just a superior fighter aircraft, but an entire industrial and logistical system that could produce, deliver, and maintain advanced weapons in quantities that overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. By the spring of 1945, German fighter pilots who had survived the transition from air superiority to desperate defense could see American P-51 Mustangs operating with complete freedom over German airspace. Cities that had never been bombed were now regular targets for Mustang-escorted bomber formations, and German civilians who had believed in ultimate victory began to understand that the war was lost. The sight of enemy fighters flying unopposed over Berlin, Munich, and other major German cities became a daily reminder that German air defenses had collapsed and that American Industrial might had produced weapons, systems that German technology and production could not counter. The post-war testimonies of German pilots who faced P-51 Mustangs consistently emphasized the shock of encountering an enemy fighter that was superior in every measurable category while being produced in overwhelming numbers. Range, speed, armament, production quantity, pilot training, and logistical support all favored the Americans to degrees that made German resistance increasingly futile. The P-51 Mustang had not just won air superiority over Germany, it had demonstrated the industrial and technological superiority of democratic nations over fascist regimes, in ways that affected German military and civilian morale at the deepest levels. The legacy of the Mustang's impact on German pilots extended beyond the immediate military consequences to influence post-war German attitudes toward American technology and industrial capability. Former Luftwaffe pilots who became part of the new West German Air Force in the 1950s carried with them profound respect for American aircraft, design and manufacturing that influenced German military, procurement and technological development for decades after the war ended. The shock of encountering P-51 Mustangs over Berlin had taught them that underestimating American capability was a mistake that Germany could never afford to make again.